አደባባይ ሚዲያ የኔ ነው። አደባባይ ሚዲያ የኔም ነው።
አደባባይ ሚዲያ የኔ ነው።
አደባባይ ሚዲያ የሁላችንም ነው።
የኛ ቤተሰብ አደባባይ ሚዲያን ይመለከታል። የእናንተስ?
Do your parents watch አደባባይ ሚዲያ?
Watch, follow, subscribe and help አደባባይ። አደባባይ ሚዲያ ለወገንተኝነት ጀርባውን የሰጠ።
አደባባይ ሚዲያ ለወገንተኝነት ጀርባውን የሰጠ ጊዜያዊ ጥቅምን አምቢኝ ብለው የዘመመን ሊያቀና እውነትና እውቀትን አስከትሎ ኢኮኖሚያዊና መንፈሳዊ መረጃዎችን እንካችሁ ይላል። ትኩስ ዜናዎች፣ ዘጋቢ ፊልሞች፣ ጥልቅ ትንታኔዎች በአደባባይ ሚዲያ ይቀርባሉ። ራእያችን ጊዜውን ያማከለና ዘመኑን የዋጀ በእውነት የነጠሩ መረጃዎችን በእውቀት ደግፎ ለሀገራችን ብሎም ለዓለም ሕዝብ ማዳረስ ነው። አድሬሳችን አደባባይ infomedia@gmail.com፣ በዌብሳይታችን www.adebabai.com። ያግኙን፣ ይርዱን። የሁላችንም ስለሆነች ኢትዮጵያ በአደባባይ እንዘግባለን። አደባባይ ሚዲያ
Welcome and thank you for joining us. This is Aregawi Media's Spirit Guidance program. My name is Fitz-Gerald and I'll be your host for today. Today we're going to be talking about the lessons we've learned from a year-long war TPLF has waged against Ethiopia and her people. The war started a year ago today on November 1st, 2020, when the TPLF army attacked the northern command of the Ethiopian army, an army that have been living and protecting amongst the Tigrayan people, coming in at night and killing them and attacking them at night. Because of this, the Ethiopian government was expected and also had to go into a law enforcement operation, which has now turned into a full-blown war, spilling over to neighboring regions within Ethiopia. Even though the war was started by TPLF, we have seen many Western medias, the UN and Biden administrations, and also humanitarian activists accusing the Ethiopian government of blocking aid, starving its people, and waging war against its people. Those of us that know well what the true information is, and know the characteristics of TPLF, know these things to be false. However, it has been really difficult, and we have seen the prominence of this misinformation being used against Ethiopia to pass sanctions, such as we've seen done by the Biden administration, to politicize AGOA and threaten Ethiopia to being removed from the AGOA, as well as the UN Security Council calling more than 10 meetings on Ethiopia and calling Ethiopia to come and respond to some of the accusations that have been put forth with no concrete evidence that they have. Another thing we've also seen is the Ethiopian government has expelled 7 of the UN officials from Ethiopia, which the UN has said this was not acceptable. However, they have said nothing about the more than 408 truck drivers and the trucks that have been lost and have been held hostage by the TPLF. We have seen these kinds of double standards by the UN, the Biden administration, and the EU on Ethiopia, which is making us really see and ask the question, why does it feel like the Western media and the Western world is against Ethiopia and running these kind of policies that is hurtful to the people and against a democratically elected government of Ethiopia? To help us answer some of the questions and also be able to look at what's been going on in Ethiopia and lessons we could take and how we can move forward, I have invited a Professor Anne Fitz-Gerald. Most of us know who she is, but I will also be introducing her, as well as Hermela Aregawi will also be joining us a little bit later to come and talk to us about how the Western media is being used to really drive policy within UN and the US and what we could do about it, and talk to us about some of the campaigns her and some of peace-loving Ethiopians are putting together to make sure that true information is being distributed, and also we could pay attention to what's going on in Ethiopia and help in any way we can. I'd like to ask everyone at this time, please go ahead and like and share this conversation. If you are new to Aregawi Media, go ahead and subscribe to our show, and would appreciate every help that you guys could give us as far as sharing this information to make sure we stand with the truth and protect our country and our interests from any foreign interference that we are currently seeing. I'd like to invite you all to stay with us, and we'll be right back.
አደባባይ ሚዲያ ለወገንተኝነት ጀርባውን የሰጠ ጊዜያዊ ጥቅምን አምቢኝ ብሎ የዘመመን ሊያቀና እውነትና እውቀትን አስከትሎ ኢኮኖሚያዊና መንፈሳዊ መረጃዎችን እንካችሁ ይላል። ትኩስ ዜናዎች፣ ዘጋቢ ፊልሞች፣ ጥልቅ ትንታኔዎች በአደባባይ ሚዲያ ይቀርባሉ። ራእያችን ጊዜውን ያማከለና ዘመኑን የዋጀ በእውነት የነጠሩ መረጃዎችን በእውቀት ደግፎ ለሀገራችን ብሎም ለዓለም ሕዝብ ማዳረስ ነው። አድሬሳችን አደባባይ ኢንፎ ሚዲያ @gmail.com፣ ዌብሳይታችን www.adebabai.com። ያግኙን፣ ይርዱን። የሁላችንም ስለሆነች ኢትዮጵያ በአደባባይ እንዘግባለን። አደባባይ ሚዲያ።
Hey everybody, this is Hermela. I'm here with Simon and Nebiyu to announce a social media campaign that will be running throughout the month of November. In November, we say #no more. No more war in Ethiopia, no more false narratives that support killers versus victims, no more media lies. The first thing that we're going to ask you to do is to take a photo of yourself holding the #no more on a piece of paper, wearing either purple or gold, and take it in front of a white background. There's some best practices for how to and how not to tweet. And so for that, I'll go to Simon.
So in our first example, we're going to show you a tweet, a perfect tweet. You see there's a lot of black, and at the very end you see some blue. The blue there should attract the eyes, and it's #no more. We're saying do not use any other hashtag other than no more. So write your message, and preferably at the end it'll say no more, or you can put no more in the middle, but it's #no more that is what we want in this campaign. So here you have a bad example of a tweet. You see that there's #TPLF terrorists, there's #Ethiopia, and then you also have mentions of the UN and USA. We don't want mentions. We don't want unnecessary hashtags. We want just one single hashtag in your message. And you'll see a cleaned up version of this on the next tweet. So you have just no more at the very end there and your message, and it's clean, it's clear. And like many successful campaigns, this is what they do. So let's try and do this. Only no more hashtag in the month of November.
And we've also established the Horn of Africa Hub on Twitter. Follow us at Horn of Africa Hub. It's going to be the central place for the people of the Horn, Ethiopians, Eritreans, Somalis to share our content. And we'll also have a link tree with sample tweet content. So join us on the Horn of Africa Hub, and we invite you to join us through this journey in the month of November. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. And if you're just joining us, welcome. And I'm going to continue to ask you all to please go ahead and share this conversation to your friends and family. We have invited Professor Fitz-Gerald today to come and talk to us about how the war has been looking like in the last year. Thank you, Professor, for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. For those of us that may not know you and your work, could you tell us a bit about yourself and the work that you do?
So my name is Anne Fitz-Gerald. I'm a professor of international security in a political science department. I'm also the director of the Balsillie School of International Affairs, a school of international affairs that's based in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. I've been in the role for 2 years. Before this, I was an academic in the UK. I guess I've been working in Ethiopia for the last 20 years, and in research capacities, in instructor capacities on postgraduate programs, and in advisory capacities as well. My work focuses on the security sector, national security and defense, and the governance and oversight of national security and defense, and of course, it concerns conflict as well. So I'm a Canadian by birth, but spent years overseas. I did my PhD overseas, and I've spent a lot of time on the African continent, living and working there, and have been privileged and honored to have spent so much time in Ethiopia.
Well, thank you. I guess one of the things I really appreciate about Twitter is for introducing people like you that are doing amazing work in defense of the truth and really being willing to seek out the truth. And I'll start my question, or I guess my discussion, with this. As we have seen right now, at the beginning of this war, it was clear and it seemed like the Western media has accepted who started it. But right now there seems to be, they're working really hard to catch some doubts as far as who has started this war, or what kind of operation that the Ethiopian government was expected or actually forced into enforcing. So could you tell us a bit about what insurgency really is and what the characteristics of that is, as far as the studies of insurgency goes?
Yeah, insurgency is a type of warfare, and it's usually in the form of an armed rebellion or an armed insurrection against the political establishment. It's usually based on the belief that there is a lack of any mechanism within the political establishment to resolve differences between two groups. Usually involves three components. And I've put out some recent publications on this. The guerrilla fighters, people at the forefront of the fighting, and second component is what's known as the auxiliary, those who are working in the communities, those who are the real communicators on the ground, who share information, who maintain a narrative, make sure everybody is social with that narrative and is informed of that narrative. And thirdly, what's known as the underground. And the underground in the past was the insurgency component that no one really saw, because they would behave as intelligence agents, looking at human interactions, human behaviors, reporting back through the chain of command on those behaviors, and observing and informing logistics and administration of the insurgency as a result of that observing. The big difference today with the underground is that it plays out on the internet instead of a place that's in close proximity with a conflict. So there's a number of theories about insurgency, and there was some very interesting research that was done that grouped insurgency styles and theories into two different models. One model was a rebellion as an investment, so conflict caused by a post-conflict payoff. Another one was rebellion as a business, conflict caused by a payoff during the conflict. And then a rebellion as a mistake, I think, is the third one, which is a conflict caused by military optimism. But two distinguishing features of an insurgency are, one, it's known as a people's war, a war amongst the people. And this is because whether the people like it or not, they become involved in the conflict, they become central and critical to the conflict, and it's a battle of the support for the people. The other critical component of an insurgency is information. So information warfare and psychological warfare plays a big role here. It's usually based on a highly organized structure, highly organized plan, support from other actors, whether those actors are internal or external. Tactics of insurgents involve trying to target critical infrastructure, trying to target critical services like medical services, pharmaceutical services, banking, finance, power, electricity, telecommunications, because overall the objective is to delegitimize the opponent. So working amongst the people to delegitimize the opponent, convince them of that delegitimization. And so a weak insurgency will be defeated easily, but a strong and successful insurgency usually aims to push the opponent to a negotiating table.
So, something that I've noticed, especially when we're talking about what's going on in Ethiopia, it felt like it only happened to us, right? It felt like this was such a unique thing that's happened. It felt like there was no, direction in which we could move forward as far as understanding TPLF, and also felt like they came up with all these sense of things where this is something that only happens in Ethiopia, and really understanding that they really took, the how-tos from an already existing theory, and they've already done these things in the beginning when they were, coming up as, an armed small militia against the Derg. Always does help in putting things in perspective. So thank you for that explanation. As we've seen, on November 4th, when they first started this insurgency, another thing we also noticed was how immediately the Tigray genocide tweets started coming out on the same day, to a point where we didn't, most of Ethiopia didn't even know yet that what has transpired in Tigray has happened. So how have you seen that kind of narrative affect how we see the war, how the world sees the war, and how it's being fought right now on Twitter?
Okay, so yes, there were references all over the internet to the term genocide. Genocide is a very, very serious term. It's a war crime. It's a crime against humanity. The definition refers to the deliberate killing of a large number of people, usually from a particular nation or ethnic group. So this was a serious part of the narrative and a serious accusation to lodge against a country, a leader, a political party. And we saw the word genocide being picked up by some policymakers as well, which made the situation even more serious, because when you use such accusatory words like that prior to any evidence-based investigation or evidence-based corroborated and triangulated reporting of the media on a crisis, then it's very difficult to step down from those sorts of accusations. And I think, we all saw this happening in different corners, not just on Twitter, but in the policy world as well. So I think it's important to note that the report that was released this week by the Joint Investigation Team representing both the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights did exonerate the government from genocide and these accusations of genocide. So that was certainly one development that brought clarity about on this. And I think the other thing that should be noted based on the data, based on the evidence, what we know is that there had been efforts to try and engage in dialogue with the TPLF leaders. And so that runs counter to the whole notion of genocide, which is to try to isolate a group and to try and really extinguish a group. That runs completely counter to that. So there were dialogue efforts that were led by political officials. There were dialogue efforts led by women's groups, by efforts to bring the TPLF involved in Destiny Ethiopia's efforts underpinning the Ministry of Peace's national dialogue. So there was also sufficient evidence, certainly leading up to November 3rd and 4th, that ran counter to the whole notion of genocide.
Mm-hmm. I think along with that, something that we've noticed as far as, the narrative war is that at the beginning, right, it was about genocide. They were going really strong with making sure that nobody was able to speak about what's going on in Tigray unless they're also saying a genocide is being committed. And we saw that once, the Ethiopian government and army left Mekelle and they started expanding the war into other regions within Ethiopia, the narrative kind of shifted more strongly towards the humanitarian crisis, aid being blocked, and the Ethiopian government starving its people on purpose and such. And that still seems to be resonating. So what's going on as far as weaponizing humanitarian aid crisis, and who's really responsible for that in the sense of bringing that narrative into the West and making sure that those kind of policies are being enforced onto the Ethiopian government from what you've noticed?
Yeah, I think this is another area that has been a blurry one, and where the narratives are quite polarized as well, not just on the Twitter channels, but in the policy space. So again, I'm an academic, so I always look at data. What do we know? Well, what we know is that the government was supplying 70% of the aid, certainly when the federal forces were on the ground in the Tigrayan regional state. We also know that the government declared a unilateral ceasefire for the purposes primarily of supporting humanitarian access to humanitarian activities and to prioritize support for the harvest and the farming season in Tigray. So aid continued, and as the primary provider of humanitarian aid leading up to the unilateral ceasefire, it was certainly nothing that was cut off. And I have friends across all 10 regions of Ethiopia, and I could see and hear of efforts at the regional state level to consolidate aid, to even give vehicles, medical equipment, pharmaceuticals. So I think the data suggests that there were some frustrations voiced by some humanitarian partners towards things like security checks and delays in getting aid through. But from what I understand and what the local media reports is that the Ministry of Peace worked through these issues with humanitarian partners and streamlined the checking process, and also expanded the routes into Tigray. So I think it's worthwhile mentioning that the government and the people were very nervous about these aid routes and aid mechanisms, especially without any federal governance capacity in the regional state of Tigray, because memories are fresh. And of course, in the mid-1980s in Ethiopia, we saw a lot of aid being diverted towards the insurgency cause, and aid misused as well. And at the time, I think there were some tensions with some humanitarian groups that, for whatever reasons, had been issued warnings, and some had had their activities suspended. So, yeah, I think that's like we're hearing still today reference to sieges and blockades, and I think that's where the biggest question mark is: who is creating a siege? I would not characterize the Ethiopian government federal forces as being responsible for a siege, nor would I say that, based on the data and based on the evidence, that there is a blockade in place for which the federal government is responsible. I think there's some realities of conflict, right? When the unilateral ceasefire was declared, the federal forces drew back, and effectively the conflict that had been sort of located around the Tembian area stretched out across the regional state, and therefore the humanitarian crisis stretched out too. So you could argue that before the withdrawal of the federal forces from Tigray, the conflict was quite contained. So then the humanitarian crisis spilled over the borders into Afar and Hamara, but so did the armed insurrection as well. And so it wasn't government forces really forming a blockade, in my view. It was government forces defending neighboring regions against armed incursions across the borders. I think then North Wallo became a target, and the zones across North Wallo, in particularly dry, arid areas that, like a number of Tigray communities, were dependent on food safety nets, so really dependent on that flow of food aid on a regular basis. They became cut off because they became occupied by TPLF fighters. And so I think those two things have to be called into question, this notion of a siege and a blockade. And again, like genocide, they're very, very strong words, and they're very accusatory as well. And once they're put into print, and once they appear on successive tweets like Samantha Power, USAID administrators' tweets, and other policymakers' tweets, then it's a very difficult platform to climb down from.
Absolutely. I think that's a struggle we're seeing even with the Ethiopian government being able to defend itself. Not that they're great communicators, but by the end of the day, it's really difficult when, people that are supposed to be helping in these kind of issues like Samantha Power or the UN, when they feel very comfortable in accusing the Ethiopian government of, blocking aid and atrocities, but kind of stay silent when it comes to what TPLF is doing, right? It kind of creates that imbalance and makes it so difficult for the government of Ethiopia really to trust their intention. So I feel like there's also that sense that they're creating within Ethiopia of distrust of the UN, distrust of the US, and distrust of really the Western intention on what's going on as far as the humanitarian crisis that has been created from what I observed.
Can I add one more thing, ሕውሐት?
Yeah.
Okay. If I could add one more thing.
Please.
About this very, and this speaks to the uniqueness of the humanitarian management situation there. Martin Griffiths has the relief coordinator, very, very strong reputation, very good at what he does. He's had leadership roles elsewhere in the world. There are some very good humanitarian partner organizations as well. But the situation in Tigray is such that when the federal forces withdrew from the region, they effectively left no governance capacity that was connected to it. The governance capacity that was there was prioritizing an armed insurgency. And as we know, the way the military has been structured over the years, and I should say military command posts have been structured, involves an integrated model of the political element of the establishment and the military and the intelligence elements of the establishment. So this model has been in place in the Tigray regional state for many years as well. And so trying to manage a humanitarian effort that is fair and equitable is very difficult when the partner that you're working with is prioritizing an armed insurgency.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something they've definitely told us as far as the TPLF leadership goes about their prioritization of how the aid or how the trucks are going to be used. I understand this is a difficult conversation, and it probably would be years before really we sat down and really figure out what went down as far as clearly having a clear understanding of what happened as far as the aid blockage goes, especially in a sense of that makes the Western media and the Western world happy. In the meantime, though, we do need aid, right? The Tigray region needs aid, the Wallo region needs aid, and Afar region needs aid right now. How do we move forward in making sure that these places have some sense of, security as far as receiving aid? From your experience with other conflicts, what has worked and what can we try or what can we possibly do in Ethiopia?
Well, usually aid is best distributed when there's no conflict going on the ground. And the reality is that conflict blocks aid too. Conflict blocks roads, conflict destroys roads using artillery firing, and conflict presents high security risks. And many international humanitarian aid groups have a security risk threshold above which they will not deliver on a service for very good reasons. So conflict really disrupts humanitarian delivery. And I say that to make the point that the conflict has to stop in order to route the humanitarian aid fairly, equitably, and effectively. And this introduces another issue, because we have seen to date no punitive measures lodged against one party to the conflict. All the punitive measures, and you mentioned in your introduction the suspension of AGOA. This is another punitive measure that's been introduced by the US government, which I suspect you want to bring up a bit later, but it's important to raise here because there's been no punitive measures directed towards the other side of the conflict, the TPLF fighters, and therefore it's questionable as to whether or not they are incentivized to lay down their arms. And so I think calls for the TPLF, which came on the offensive, which committed the border incursion on the offensive, whereas the ENDF forces, to my knowledge, and according to the local reports and what I read, were maintaining a defensive posture. Okay, airstrikes, you could say, were a form of going on the offensive, but the airstrikes were targeting munitions, weaponry, battlefield hubs, training centers. They were precision targets that targeted back hubs. I think some came to the front hubs as well when more artillery started being located on the other side of the Tossa mountain. And but until then, they were not in the Tigray regional state. They were on the Amhara side of the border in a defensive posture. So conflict has to stop to get the aid distributed across Tigray, across Afar, and across Amhara and all the conflict-affected communities. How will that conflict stop? Both sides have to be incentivized for the conflict to stop, or incentivized in a positive or a negative way. So I think the only option is for external actors and global powers like the United States of America to threaten punitive measures in the direction of the TPLF, or else it will keep bringing, what I understand is happening now, bringing all sorts of people, women, children, elderly, men, to the front line to help pursue its objectives.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely what we've been seeing in really understanding that, like you said, it's difficult when you have a conflict going on, when there's a war going on, to say we need unrestricted access to the war region. And again, incentivizing or not incentivizing only one aspect of that conflict has really hurt us, I think. In that sense, we're gonna take a quick break and watch a short video about how the war, like you were saying, the young and the old are really participating in, and a unique war that Ethiopia is currently facing in, and how they told us to begin with, the TPLF leaders, how they're gonna engage in that war. In the meantime, I'd like to ask people that are currently watching us to please go ahead and share and like this conversation, and we'll be right back after this video.
ዝውግእ ናይ ፍሉይ ሓይሊ ናይ ሚሊሻ ይኮነ ናይ ህዝቢ ናይ ኩሉ ህዝቢ ስለ ዝኾነ ድማ ህዝባዊ ኩናት ኢና ንለዎ እዚ ወራር እዩ ዝግመፅ ዘሎ ህዝባዊ ኩናት ኢና ንሕና ንውልዕ ህዝባዊ ኩናት ናይ ህዝቢ ውግእ ማለት እዩ ኩሉ ዝሳተፈሉ ማለት እዩ ኣብ ቆልዓ ጀሚር ኩሉ ናይ ወታደራት ግጥም ዝበሃል ይብልና ንሕና ወታደር ስለ ዘልየና እንተዘይ ኮይኑ ኩሉ እዩ በባዓሙ ዋጋይ ክምክት ኩሉ ትግራዋይ ካልእ ዝድግፍ ክድግፊ ግን ንሕና ኩሉ ከም ተጋሩ ክንገጥም ኢና ሓድነትና ሒዝና ስለዚ ፍትሓዊ ኩናት እዩ ፍትሓዊ ኩናት ስለ ዝኾነ ድማ ክንስዕሮም ኢና ፀጊብና ኣይኮንና ፊዕፊዕልና ኣይኮንና ብጉልበቱ ከንበርከና ንዝመፀ ክንቀብሮ ኢና ብስሩ ታሪክና ንሱ እዩ እዚኣ ክትፍለጥ ኣለዋ
when they told us this, I think for me, I've said this, and I think I'll continue to struggle with this as far as having the imagination to truly understand the amounts or the capabilities of TPLF as far as what they're capable of doing. But one topic within this, people's war that they call, I wanted to bring into attention is the use of child soldiers. The first time we saw that in the Western media being reported was the New York Times. And they had this image that they're using, and instead of calling them child soldiers as they were, they called them highly motivated young fighters, freedom fighters. And the way in which these children are being used in a war, I think I read somewhere as young as 5-year-olds. I have such a hard time understanding that or accepting that. I have nieces and nephews. Even the 10-year-olds and 15-year-olds, I have a hard time imagining them going into a war, let alone 5-year-olds. And we see the international community just kind of staying silent with that. What is going on with that? If you could tell us a bit about, the use of child soldiers within a war and how the international community has said that's something that they will condemn or they will fight against, and why is that silence when it comes to the Ethiopian children? Are they not worthy of that condemnation? Or can you tell us a bit about how you saw that, I guess?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
There are international protocols and conventions about the use of children, condemning the use of children in conflict. And that goes beyond carrying a weapon and using a weapon. That involves any kind of logistics, like cooking, like supplying, like providing a watch role or an intelligence role, any sort of planning or logistics. And so this is a war crime, and it's a crime that the international community has stood up against. It's a crime that has been condemned by not just countries and national governments across the world and within the donor community, but also by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and other NGOs that are concerned about security and justice. We've seen these kind of crimes being called out in northeast Nigeria, in South Sudan, in Uganda. And in fact, in Uganda, there was a special forces, a large special forces contingent sent in by the US government supporting the Ugandan Defense Forces in the hunt for Joseph Kony, the rebel leader of the Lord's Resistance Army. The LRA, the Lord's Resistance Army, used child soldiers, and we saw this become a U.S. foreign policy priority at one stage, and an effort that went viral to try to bring an end to it. So then we go to Ethiopia, and looking at the data again and what existed that spoke to this issue, there were photos taken by the New York Times reporter and camera personnel on the ground. Children were described as mavericks, very keen and motivated fighters. And, you know, I found it very concerning that mainstream media reporters would describe a situation in that way when it went against all sorts of international laws to even have that in place at the outset. We saw footage that other journalists captured. We saw children carrying weapons whilst in the backs of trucks. We saw empirical accounts coming from Raya and Alamata, where interviews were conducted with different residents that reported that many children were taken between the ages of 8 and 15. We saw reports of very tragically and sadly bodies of children that had been found near the Afar-Tigray border. Evidence produced by the Office of the Attorney General recently about the conflict in Ahmara and the atrocities committed there, which involved children, involved youth. And we've also had reports of from the government, which have been covered by local media, about the interviews that were conducted with the minors that had been taken to safe sanctuary from both the battlefields in Afar and Amara. So yes, it's all still subject to more in-depth, rigorous, and robust methodological investigations, but the data is there, and people have written about it. Doreen Nickel, a Canadian writer, wrote a piece about it. Others have questioned it, but we've seen a real absence of statements on this issue, when in some cases the numbers are much higher than numbers that have been reported on elsewhere on the African continent.
Absolutely. I think that's something I still have a hard time really understanding, and also knowing that, do we even have the resources later on to rehabilitate these children and make sure that they're a healthy individual within a society? And that's something I think we'll continue to pay for as a nation, and we'll continue to have to work through and struggle as well. Next, our guest, I guess our other guest, Hermela Aregawi, is here with us. We're going to continue this conversation and move forward with talking about what the mainstream media is doing and what we could do in this fight as Ethiopians, as Americans, as people that want to stay and stand with the truth. We'll be right back after this quick break.
አደባባይ ሚዲያ ለወገንተኝነት ጀርባውን የሰጠ ጊዜያዊ ጥቅምን አምቢኝ ብለው የዘመመን ሊያቀና እውነትና እውቀትን አስከትሎ ኢኮኖሚያዊና መንፈሳዊ መረጃዎችን እንካችሁ ይላል። ትኩስ ዜናዎች፣ ዘጋቢ ፊልሞች፣ ጥልቅ ትንታኔዎች በአደባባይ ሚዲያ ይቀርባሉ። ራእያችን ጊዜውን ያማከለና ዘመኑን የዋጀ በእውነት የነጠሩ መረጃዎችን በእውቀት ደግፎ ለሀገራችን ብሎ ለዓለም ሕዝብ ማዳረስ ነው። አድሬሳችን አደባባይ ኢንፎ ሚዲያ @gmail.com፣ ዌብሳይታችን www.adebabai.com። ያግኙን፣ ይርዱን። የሁላችንም ስለሆነች ኢትዮጵያ በአደባባይ እንዘግባለን። አደባባይ ሚዲያ።
Welcome back, everyone, and welcome, Hermela, and thank you for being here with us. If you're just joining us, we're having a conversation with Professor Fitz-Gerald and Hermela Aregawi. Journalist Hermela Aregawi has just joined us. I'd like to ask everyone to please go ahead and like and share this conversation. Also, people that are currently in Clubhouse listening to this conversation, I'd like to give a shout out to Diva, Sheila, and all of you there. Thank you for tuning in. I'd like to say thank you for tuning in. So as we are having this conversation, I think one of the main things that we've seen that seems to take a lot of Ethiopian Americans by surprise is a month of war that was waged against us on social media in a way that we've never seen before, in a way that it took us a while to understand, in a way that was very, very well organized. So in that sense, I'll start with you, Hermela. What have you seen? Have you seen a pattern in these misinformations being produced and redistributed? Like, where does it start? How does it go? And how does that end up, in people's hand as far as being consumed by individuals that may not necessarily have the time to sit down and really investigate what the truth behind these stories is?
Yeah, I think there's a really strong apparatus that is international that allows a lot of this misinformation to continue to happen. But I think the originators of the information continue to be TPLF officials and TPLF activists who are feeding the places like CNN, New York Times, AP, the information that they want them to write about. And sadly, journalists go ahead and take that to be the whole story when they know better from their training. They should talk to people who have different ideas, who have opposing ideas, but you just never hear the voices of people who say it's not genocide. This is actually an issue of a political group that was in power for far too long and very much oppressively. And they are not doing their job. And I think what it does is it emboldens activists and it emboldens TPLF officials to continue to do what they're doing, to continue to kill people, to continue to call for a coup or a violent coup against an elected government. And I think until some stronger media powers start to poke holes in that narrative, they'll continue to do what they're doing and push forward because they feel like the lie is winning right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you could jump in here as well, is there a way, have you started seeing the mainstream media a little bit different since the war in Ethiopia, and how has that affected the way you see mainstream media and the information they distribute?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't disagree with what Hermela's just said. And there were elements of the mainstream media that I didn't follow particularly before because of the tendency towards sensationalized reporting as opposed to investigative reporting. But yeah, I mean, there's been entities out there whose conduct and behavior has been very surprising. And we talked earlier on about this notion of accusatory and very, very strong language, which when set out without any investigations, without any evidence base for it, with very methodologically weak reports that have been conducted, some of which involved taking phone numbers that were given to NGOs investigating some of these issues, when they didn't know who they were talking to. They were miles away, like in different regions from where they were talking to these people. It all really, really begs so many questions. And, you know, there is definitely a false narrative out there, but there are other trends that were worrying too. There's a trend that makes decent efforts to get an initial story, let's call it a root story, but then it's misinterpreted and reported as a result of that interpretation, which is based on ignorance in some ways, people who just parachute in and try to report on Ethiopia and its complex interfederal dynamics in a way that they just don't know about. Then you had very lopsided accounts, and then you had accounts in some cases that tried to straddle the both sidesism. And this was very problematic too, because the narratives were poles apart. So you know right away that there's a problem. Like I'm an academic. When I look at research, when we all look at research, diverse views are important. And there are anomalies, but those anomalies can usually be explained and linked to the central issue. But we're talking about two different radar screens here completely. So anyone trying to do a decent job of analyzing would pick the authentic and the verifiable data, but people aren't doing that. They're just defaulting to one side, and it's predominantly the TPLF narrative side. So they're the trends that I'm picking up.
I guess as I have you, I want to ask you another question that I am noticing also. I guess a lot of people are also starting to notice, and we've seen a few trends on that as well. What is integrity really when we're talking about research? And I'll also come to Hermela about journalistic integrity, but I have seen even today, right, people that are supposed to be researchers that are qualified as or called as researchers, especially people that are considered to be the experts on the Horn of Africa, are even today saying that TPLF is almost in Addis Ababa, and you're almost like having people panic and spreading information that absolutely is not true, that with no facts, especially in these areas where they continue to say, oh, there's no, internet is closed, phone is closed, we have no information, there's no way to get, it's all blacked out. But then at the same time, they continue to say, TPLF is almost here, TPLF is almost here. We also noticed in Kenya right now, they're getting ready to accept X amount of refugees from Ethiopia because TPLF is definitely going to make it to Addis Ababa today. Even one of them, Tita is saying today on November 4th, TPLF will be in Addis Ababa. So what is, as an expert, as someone that we consider you as an expert as well, what is your integrity? What is the responsibility experts and researchers have in making sure that they don't participate into this misinformation and be discredited as a source of information for us?
I'll say 3 quick points. The first point is that let's go back to this issue of an insurgency. Remember the 3 blocks. There's the core, the fighters, then the auxiliary, and then the underground. The underground plays out on the keyboard. The auxiliary has different layers and involves external actors. And I'm not pointing fingers in any direction, but that's what a typical insurgency involves. So information flows are everything, with the objective to totally delegitimize an opponent. So I can see these calls, and there were even calls put out by a specific embassy today encouraging local staff to leave, changing an advisory on the situation in Addis Ababa. And many of us were rooting for information to find out what was actually happening on the ground, to be told that the fighting was still at least 300 kilometers away from the city. And so that's the first thing. It concerns insurgency. And then the second thing is integrity. Well, integrity is everything for civil society organizations. And my father always told me, treat it like a jewel, a gem, a precious gem. Don't let it get dusty. Don't let it get chipped. Don't let anything happen to it, because once it does, even by a speckle, it's gone. So civil society, we are, I guess our reputation is based on the integrity of our reporting. So we must be very painful about the truth and facts. And we're seeing the third thing that I'll link this to, and then I'll hand over to Hermela, is that we're seeing a bit of a blur between activists and analysts and researchers and academicians. And I think it's because everybody's rushing to get a commentary, and we're losing peer review along the way. And peer review is a really, really important aspect of civil society reporting. It's going through different eyes, going through people with good editorial skills, and getting those people to ask difficult questions to those producing it, making sure there's fairness and balance. And academics, media reporters, think tank members, local associations, we don't have our jobs to tout the narratives of our friends or our acquaintances. We have our jobs to report with integrity and report based on facts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll move this question over to Hermela, but could you, Hermela, tell us a bit about the difference between activism and journalism, which I feel like we're losing right now? And also tell us a bit about some journalists that you found have really done the due diligence in making sure that this conflict is being reported with the best intention and with the most truth as possible.
Some good questions. Yeah. So, I think that if journalism was done well, you would see a lot less activism. A lot of the times the reaction from activists is because the story is not being told, because they feel like the facts are getting twisted. Like in my case, I look like I'm moving in the direction of activism because there's not enough journalism, right? And that's sort of what's starting to happen in terms of the trends globally. You can almost be sure that the mainstream narrative about something is likely to be the false narrative because it has so much money and power and infrastructure behind it. A couple of more things to what you brought up earlier is, with my time working at Al Jazeera America, even with local news, we have the tendency to want to particularly predict disasters, because you have to fill up space every day on a particular show. And so it seems interesting to the audience to get people on to say, is this going to be is TPLF going to win? Are they going to go to Addis? What are the chances? What you'll notice with true scholars like Professor Ann and the paper that was written recently by her and Hugh Siegel in a Peace and Diplomacy Institute is that it doesn't go into disaster predicting. It doesn't even go into predicting at all, one way or the other. It just kind of lays down the foundation of what we're looking at and what we should be supporting based on what we're looking at. It's not sensational, right? It's doing exactly what it's supposed to do as academics and scholars, and that's not what you see in a lot of mainstream media. To also Professor Ann's point about picking and choosing what is corroborated, with the cross-referencing, that's called critical thinking, right? That's something that a lot of people don't do, either intentionally or unintentionally. And unfortunately, a lot of the main outlets like New York Times and CNN's Nima El-Bagir, they are definitely just weaving one narrative, right? And they've been elevated in these organizations that are considered to be pillars of journalism. And so they can just get away with not telling a balanced story. As far as places that I think are doing well, I think BT Newsroom is really underrated. They did a wrap up of the context around this war recently, and it was excellently done. And then slowly but surely, there are more, I would say, non-mainstream outlets that are doing the job that you would wish some of the bigger ones were doing. So we're trying to find them, but it's usually coming through academics and some of the more what you would consider new media, as opposed to the ones that we all already know about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm really thankful in a sense that we are big enough as a population to be able to share this information the way we have been able to in social media and such, so that this conflict or whatever decision Biden's administration or the Western world is going to make is not going to be made in silence, right? We're not going to accept this in silence. And it's been really powerful in making sure that we're going to say our piece. In that sense, also, though, how do you guys suggest, or if you have 2 pointers that you could give us as far as breaking the cycle of, activists as being used as experts, and then that information going to the mainstream media and that being used as a way to drive policy? If Anne can start and Hermela can add into it.
Yeah, I think a more judicious approach obviously needs to go into how we consume knowledge and how we use that knowledge. And I've been thinking about this because it was sort of hitting me as well. And I've recently been involved in a study on national security threats here in Canada. And this is a big issue for the new national security risk threat spectrum, not just the infiltration of foreign agents that are seeking to intimidate and penetrate society on the ground, but doing it through digital intimidation as well. And doing it in more of a masked style, which we're seeing through penetration into civil society organizations, trying to get universities that are reputable or think tanks that are reputable to hold seminars, to push for certain reports and executive summaries to come out of those seminars, and to have those published with a credible university's name on it, which gives credibility de facto to the document. So we're seeing all sorts of trends break out. How do we manage this? I don't think it would be a bad idea to have some sort of grading system or some sort of rubric that evaluate. It would have to be driven by civil society and not government. But if a country like Ethiopia brought representatives from its universities and think tanks together and formulated a rubric for how they rated different media outlets, then I think it would have a positive effect on it would be a win-win solution, because the media outlets would want to climb in their ratings year on year, and the people would read better, well-informed, investigated, corroborated, and evidence-based material. Transparency International has done this with defense companies and defense forces over the world, like Mo Ibrahim Index has done this for governance purposes. But certainly with Transparency International's experience, it invites competition because people see their neighbor next door, the country next door, and they think, oh, they've got a higher rating than us. We want to get up there too, and do the wherewithal to climb up those ratings. I don't think that's necessarily a bad idea.
I love that. We do that with restaurants here in Seattle, and it works wonderfully well. Hermela, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great idea. Not something I thought of, but definitely something that is needed, because I think that's where the confusion is. On one hand, we elevate the CNNs and the Reuters because there's some things they seem to get right. And then on one hand, we're saying they're getting it completely wrong on Ethiopia. So if scholars that know Ethiopia could come together and say, yeah, CNN definitely an F, New York Times an F, and then, Reuters maybe a B and C sometimes, or whatever the case. If there was some sort of rubric, it would help people, because one of the things I have some empathy for is, and this was me early on in this war, is people think, what, CNN's reporting it, and the UN is saying this, and this place is saying it. How could it be that they're all bought by TPLF? How could it be that they're all getting it wrong? So those are people that, maybe really are open to a different narrative, or were in the beginning, and maybe now they've gone too far down that propaganda hole, that just didn't know that these institutions could get things so wrong, whether intentionally or unintentionally. So there has to be some organized, agreed upon way of grading them, like Professor Ann said, so that instead of it's just a bunch of people screaming on social media that this is wrong, this is fake news, there's a group of academics that can regularly grade and regularly give feedback. That's something that I think that we don't have in real time. Like, the opposite of it does have a really well-oiled infrastructure, right? It's these companies that have a lot of money, that have been in media for a long time, so they have a lot of platform, a lot of space, and then the activists also are very much organized. They're working around the clock, so not everybody can do what they're doing. So if there was a group that can do it on their behalf, then or the group do it on behalf of the people, then I think that would help us move forward. Because one of the things that I've learned so much is this has happened to so many countries. It happened to Haiti, it happened to Venezuela, Bolivia, Syria, even. People talk about those countries now that I'm linking up with leaders in those spaces and say, this is exactly what happened to us. It's a formula almost. You say it's a genocide, supporting a rebel group of some sort of insurgency, and you keep pushing at the government that you're trying to overthrow, saying they're genocidal, they're committing war crimes. And so you just wonder if it happens so many times, and if there is a formula, there has to be a way to combat it, so that every time it happens to a new country, we don't treat it like it's a new approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also it really does help in, like you said, being able to connect with different leaders from different parts of the world. And with the misinformation, something that I really noticed is when I try to follow specific issues within different regions, like you were mentioning in Haiti and such, it's really difficult to know which one is the truth, because I didn't realize there was this formula already in place that's been used, right? Now, next time when there's an issue like that, I'll be able to pick up on these kind of stories and be able to say, okay, like, let me find the truth, which is contrary to what the mainstream media is telling me, or what this activist is telling me, or what this expert is telling me. But it does take some time to really understand this is a narrative that's being used over and over again. And earlier I was also mentioning that when this started, it felt like this only happened to Ethiopia. Like, nowhere in the world has this ever happened. This is the worst thing that is happening to us, right? And it took us a while, at least for me too. It took me a while to know, like, no, this is not a new thing that is happening to Ethiopia. This is a well-done, a well-used rubric that they keep on using over and over again whenever an interest of the Western world, or whatever their interest is, that they're trying to pass on. So in that sense, Anne, could you tell us a bit about how useful, or I guess, or unuseful Twitter has been in making sure that the information is out there, making sure that Ethiopians have a way to fight this current war and the cyber aspect of it? And Hermela, you could go ahead and tell us after Anne what you guys are doing about the struggles that we are faced in the Twitter world.
Yeah, I'm not a great person to ask about Twitter, because I don't know, it seemed to be a North American thing for academics to use full throttle, rather than academics based in the UK, although trends catch on. And so although I subscribed to my Twitter in 2013, I only started using it when I moved back to Canada in 2019. So I think the problem relates to something much more strategic, and that is that internet governance lacks relevant and useful policies that can keep up with the realities on the keyboard. Or let's tip that argument on its head. The realities on the keyboard are outstripping the pace of policy development in this area. So there's a lack of oversight and accountability. I mean, there's been some horrendous things lodged my way on numerous occasions. And my colleagues said, oh, you've got to report that. And you report it, you hear nothing. So I always ask myself, wow, if this stuff is not being condemned and not being heaved off their domain and their space, what do you need to do to commit a crime on Twitter? I really don't think the accountability framework is even a fraction of the way there to keep us reporting responsibly, to keep the future, which is digital and all about digitalization, prepared for what this could explode to. So Hermela, you're more of an expert on this than me, but that's my feeling today.
Yeah. Okay, I like that. I know, Hermela, you have a campaign also being launched. I'm going to go ahead and play that video quickly, and then I'll come back to your comments on how you've been watching this fight unfold on Twitter.
Hey everybody, this is Hermela. I'm here with Simon and Nebiyu to announce a social media campaign that will be running throughout the month of November. In November, we say hashtag no more. No more war in Ethiopia, no more false narratives that support killers versus victims, no more media lies. The first thing that we're going to ask you to do is to take a photo of yourself holding the hashtag no more on a piece of paper, wearing either purple or gold, and take it in front of a white background. There's some best practices for how to and how not to tweet. And so for that, I'll go to Simon.
So in our first example, we're going to show you a tweet, a perfect tweet. You see there's a lot of black, and at the very end, you see some blue. The blue there should attract the eyes, and it's hashtag no more. We're saying do not use any other hashtag other than no more. So write your message, and preferably at the end, it'll say no more, or you can put no more in the middle, but it's hashtag no more. That is what we want in this campaign. So here you have a bad example of a tweet. You see that there's hashtag TPLF terrorists, there's hashtag Ethiopia, and then you also have mentions of the UN and USA. We don't want mentions. We don't want unnecessary hashtags. We want just one single hashtag in your message. And you'll see a cleaned up version of this on the next tweet. So you have just no more at the very end there and your message, and it's clean, it's clear. And like many successful campaigns, this is what they do. So let's try and do this. Only no more hashtag in the month of November.
And we've also established a Horn of Africa hub on Twitter. Follow us at Horn of Africa hub. It's going to be the central place for the people of the Horn, Ethiopians, Eritreans, Somalis to share our content. And we'll also have a link tree with sample tweet content. So join us on the Horn of Africa hub, and we invite you to join us through this journey in the month of November. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Hermela, how have you noticed, or what have you seen in the war, in the narrative war that is currently happening in Twitter, trends that you noticed, and also tell us a bit about what the importance of this campaign you guys have launched.
So this campaign was a collaboration with, Simon and Nebiyu, who you saw there. We felt like we had to do something for the anniversary, but then it was Simon who suggested, why don't we do something for the month of November? And then we're going through some hashtags, and we don't want to go with the obvious Ethiopia prevails, Ethiopia truth. It just, it was too obvious. And when you look back on some of the campaigns that did the best, like hashtag bring back our girls or me too, they're one of those things that you have to go, me too what, or what does bring back our girls? It's more broad. It tends to get more attention. And so that's what we were hoping to do with the hashtag, or still are hoping to do for the month of November with hashtag no more, because I think everybody's just so sick of one war, hearing about killings every day, seeing these headlines that are completely misleading, seeing the US move in the direction that just doesn't make any sense, that just is guaranteed to be a disaster if it keeps moving forward. And so we just wanted a platform for it to be able to share information. And unfortunately, Twitter is that. I'm sort of an unwilling participant. I wish I spent a lot less time on Twitter, but what I have found is that is a space that is afforded to everybody for free. And it's a place where if you're organized about it, and if you're really good about your information, you can start to drive things through in terms of information. I think that hashtag Tigray Genocide has done that really well, has driven it through. Now, I don't think that they would be as successful if they didn't have all the media collaborators, I would say accomplices, to help them pump out their narrative, but it's certainly a space where they spend a lot of that time. So it's just nowadays, you can't just say, oh, we know what the truth is, we know we're doing the right thing, and it's gonna bring us to, it'll pull us through or push us through. It won't. You have to participate in the conversation. You have to tell your stories. One of the things I was saying yesterday on one of the platforms I was on is Ethiopians can't just say, yes, the Northern Command was attacked. You have to actually tell those stories. Who are those people? Let's see their faces. Let's get their names. Let's talk about what their families are losing. And it has to be displayed on the international stage as opposed to just Ethiopians on Ethiopian media. It's those kind of things that allow the false narrative to live without being checked. And I think we still have a lot more work to do in that regard. I mean, Twitter is just a starting point. It looks like the campaign is doing pretty well. We're at 10,000 followers. We've got a link tree, linktree.com/Horn of Africa Hub rather. And that's a place where people can see the tweet that they want to tweet. They click on it. It takes them to their Twitter app. And then all they have to do is tweet, because people do participate in Twitter, but they're not necessarily sharing information. They're sharing their frustration. Maybe they're just sharing the hashtag. And we want, when people can click on that hashtag, we want them to be able to get some context about what's going on. I mean, one of the sources we used yesterday was from the Peace and Diplomacy Institute. The professor Ann co-wrote that paper. It was amazing. It was like full of so much context. Something like, the fact that Abiy Ahmed chose to delay the election because of COVID was talked about as if it's something that's just a lie and it's never done. And what I learned from that paper is 78 other countries did the same thing based on what international advisors advised because of the pandemic. So when you get context like that, when you get information, when you can share in a way that anybody can read it, I think it helps alleviate the frustration because you're actually helping set the narrative straight. And I'm still very hopeful that over time, this story or this side of the Ethiopian story will not be ignored in the same way that it is now.
So, and that's in making sure that we all participate in this hashtag or in this campaign. You guys have made an instructional video, as I have just seen. But could you tell us a bit about why the purpose of these specific ways of tweeting? Does it really make a huge difference, or is it just so that it looks good or looks better?
Yes, I'm actually glad you asked. It does make a huge difference. I went into just policing people individually and I thought, okay, this is actually not an efficient way to do this. So we have to really just try to send the message out. Here's the thing. People tend to, at UN, at USAID, at USAID, at Secretary Blinken, and they put a bunch of ads and a bunch of hashtag Ethiopia, hashtag Eritrea, hashtag Ethiopia prevails. And visually speaking, that just, you don't see whatever information they have in there. You just see a bunch of tags. Like, for example, in terms of a real personal example. So when people at me along with 10 other people on something, I almost don't see it. I don't see the information because it just looks like junk. It looks like junk to me on my timeline. So unless I really make the effort to say, oh, who is this person? What are they saying? Which you can't really do with every tweet on social media, then it just kind of gets lost. So we're trying to encourage people to get into the habit of just taking information that you see on somebody's tweet and just feel free to copy paste it. I think one of the things I learned from being on the inside of the other camp is they don't care about it being organic. They don't care that, when they send a letter to a congressperson, everybody's writing their own letter. They come up with a letter, they come up with some tweets, and everybody's asked to push it. So I think it comes from a place of honesty, not wanting to just copy paste, wanting to be organic, wanting to use their voice, but it doesn't work in these spaces. It just needs to be clean. It needs to be factual, because our audience is not the Ethiopian audience. It hasn't been for a long time. Our audience are people, academics, journalists, people that just care about what's going on in the world, to be able to easily understand. And they can't understand that when someone's just, writing a bunch of things that just really only make sense to Ethiopians who already know about the issue.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that with us. For those that are just joining us, welcome back. And we're having a conversation with journalist Hermela Aregawi and Professor Fitz-Gerald. We're at the end of our program here, and I have just a couple of questions or discussion points for you guys. And you, as Hermela was just mentioning, you published an article yesterday that really tries to highlight what's going on in Ethiopia, and you entitled it, I apologize, this is not the right one. But the idea behind it was to say the international community needs to do a better job of representing the truth and making sure that we protect the interests of the world as far as how we I'm at a loss for a word now, how we look at democracy, right? And making sure that we protect that right now. Could you tell us a bit about what drove that paper and what you wish for moving forward in a way we understand and see conflicts in the world?
Morning. 2 mornings ago. It's a very sad week, right? It marks the anniversary of a very destructive 12 months that has brought great disruption to many families across Ethiopia, many individuals, groups, and families and communities. And so let me start by saying that, because I want to pay tribute to that and the suffering that's been caused. But at the same time, I think we've lost our way a little bit, or certainly with the media noise and the misinformation and disinformation. I wanted to write something with my very eminent colleague, and I do need to pay tribute to him too, Hugh Siegel, that brings things back to basics. You know, at the end of the day, we had not just what Hermela said about the COVID experience in so many different other countries around the world. There were accusations that were lodged that were baseless accusations right from the word go, that were baseless in terms of evidence. We had an election that saw a landslide victory for a certain government, an election that with the votes that were cast in September amounted to 80% of the eligible voters that could go out and vote. That is something that any Western democracy would be very, very proud of as well. And it's a great beacon of light on the African continent and for the developing world. And these things matter. And if global justice as a strategic policy agenda matters to Western powers at the moment, then that projection shouldn't stop within the borders. It needs to go out to the rest of the world. And, you know, liberal democratic values, what are they? Well, they include rule of law, they include a favorable world order and a predictable world order, they include political democracy, individual rights and freedoms. And if you analyze what has happened to Ethiopia, a place that we all care very deeply about, through that lens, you can come to the conclusion, a twofold conclusion. One, that the country's got a really raw deal, and that we're seeing a liberal application of those values and the selective application of humanity. Secondly, we see a real question mark over where this is going and who can do something about where this is going. And we've talked in this interview about the misinformation, disinformation, media ethics, reporting ethics. This is a big lesson to learn from. But I think what we wanted to do is bring it back to basics and say, this is a situation, actually what this points to is a big win for the authoritarians. This comes right into the hands of leaders like President Xi from China and Vladimir Putin from Russia that talk about the flaws of democracy. And the flaws that they cite are what we're seeing. And if democracy can't be stood for in Ethiopia, then it can't be stood for anywhere else in the world.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that with us. And thank you once again for really championing the truth and making sure that we had the information that we need to fight the narrative that war that is waged against Ethiopia right now. And Hermela, could you also give us, your last words, what you've been up to, where we can find you, and any notices that, or I guess information you want to share with us as far as upcoming next?
Thank you. Yeah, just definitely keep staying a part of the conversation. Like I said, linktree.com/Horn of Africa Hub, 3 buttons, and you can tweet, all day. When you get a second, just hit the tweet throughout the day, because I think that fortunately or unfortunately, is an important platform. I'm at Hermela TV on everything. I just want to add one more thing, because yesterday when Professor Ann's paper came out, I found myself just like giddy reading through it. And I imagine that's how some people felt when I started speaking out and saying the obvious. But the reason I felt that way is because, you know, there was so much contradicting and just blatant hypocrisy happening on the world stage. So when you see people that are in that world, international affairs, actually say some of those basic underlying premises, it's just like, if you're a person of truth, it's just so exciting, right? So I think that is what people are so thirsty for scholars and leaders to say what we all thought we were saying about shared values and democracy, because you can, as much as you feel like you know what's going on, you can kind of feel like, what world are we living in when this is a dominating narrative? And I think that it's so important to have people like that, and to find them in the journalism world as well, so that they can help support what you know to be true. So, and one way for us to do that is on social media. So definitely please participate, #NoMore. It's all month long, so no excuses.
Thank you. Thank you, Abe. Thank you both for being here with us, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'd like to give just a tribute to our fallen heroes that have given us the opportunity to continue to say that we are still Ethiopians. We have a country that we're going to fight for, and we are going to stand by you guys' side. I know it's not the same. They're on the ground, dying every day, struggling through everything that we're seeing, and having to fight people you consider your own is hard. Having to fight children is hard. Having to fight pregnant women that are coming at you is hard. I can't comprehend it. So I just want to take the moment to really pay tribute and say thank you for protecting my land, protecting us, and protecting the weak, and making sure, again, like I said, I have a place I call home. So I just want to say thank you for that, and thank you both for being here with us.
We're with you. Honestly, we're with you. Sometimes I don't focus on it so I could just stay trucking. But when you really stop to think about what the loss is, it's really so sad, and it's so avoidable. And they're not just fighting for Ethiopia. They're just fighting for basic human rights. And it's something that is going to be noticed across the world. So I feel your pain. I really do. And I just hope that we can get out of this sooner than later.
Absolutely. And we'll forgive, but we'll always make sure that we don't forget them. And that's something that we could do, all of us could do, paying tribute and remembering their sacrifices. Again, thank you for being here with us and having this conversation. I will be back next week with a different conversation to talk about what's going on in Ethiopia, and also the new report that was released by the joint investigation of the US and the Ethiopian government. Thank you everyone for being here, and have a wonderful week.